In today's episode, we talk about an anomaly for real estate investors. How do so many investors end up being slumlords? What's the genesis of the decision to become a slumlord? Does anybody start out on day one excitedly proclaiming that slumlording is a career for them? So how do so many investors get there? What are those small decisions that amount over time to slumlording? What's the cost of slumlording? The dollars and cents of it. How you get there and how you avoid it is the topic that we discussed today. It's a really interesting episode. You don't hear this in all the other podcasts. I think this is worth your time. Let's get right into it.
Ever wonder what burn your boats means? Picture this. 10, 15, 20 years from now, you are living your best life. You are not bound by the chains of a W-2 income. You're traveling, watching your children grow, being present in their lives. You're fulfilling all of your dreams and ambitions. Burn the boats is a powerful metaphor for making positive changes in life and moving forward despite challenges. It means creating a new reality by breaking free from old habits, people, and tools that hold you back. Burning your boats is when you realize your worth, your value, and you make the choice to create change. Clark and David are successful real estate investors who understand the importance of wealth creation and breaking free of financial anxiety. They believe that anyone can achieve this by thinking differently, learning new skills, and saying no to things that do not align with your goals. This podcast highlights pivotal moments and milestones in life that can set you on a new path towards realizing your full potential. Make the choice to join Clark and David and their guests as they share their own experiences and what they have learned to do and not to do in real estate investing, and share how you too can start your journey in creating meaningful wealth and live the life you deserve.
So there's a topic that we're going to hit on today, David, that is something that you don't hear a lot about. And I think that's why it's actually near and dear to my heart, because I've gone through it, experienced it, and I've tried to get out of this. And that topic today is basically going from why would you become a slumlord? Okay. So David, it's kind of like the frog in the pot, right? The frog drops in the water, right? And it's just kind of simmering hot and the everything is fine. But then that water starts to heat up and you start to see the frog struggle. And that's basically kind of the summary of what we're going to talk about today, where you are the frog, you are the investor, you are the accidental slumlord that you didn't even know you were going to be the slumlord. And then all of a sudden one day it hits you and you're now a slumlord.
I don't hear too many people when they're starting out their real estate journey say, yeah, my goal is to end up being a slumlord. That's the direction I want to go. And yeah, it's amazing how many investors do end up that way. And so today we're going to talk about the genesis of the idea. Why do so many well-intentioned real estate investors end up as slumlords? How does it happen? How does it come about? What's at play? What's the cost of it? How does it manifest itself over time? And then, we'll, in conclusion, discuss how to avoid it. And so, Clark, this is a topic that is near and dear to our hearts. I'm going to give you a good example of something that I ran up against a couple of weeks ago, which just highlights this topic perfectly. A wholesaler throws a 6-unit building over to me. And so there's usually a bit of drama and usually a bit of background story to a wholesaler deal. You, as a former recovering wholesaler, know that all too well. And so I go and I look at this 6 unit. I start digging into the story behind it. I meet the neighbors. It turns out that this lady bought this 6 unit, 18 years ago. And of the 6 units in the building, exactly 0 of them are paying any rent at all. Nobody's paying rent. The building's falling down. The building had to be sold. This is how it came to me, at an $800,000 discount
That's crazy.
from market.
That's
So
crazy.
here we have a lady collecting 0 rent, deferred maintenance in every direction you look, and having to dispose of the asset with an $800,000 discount to market. And so left her very vulnerable to somebody like a wholesaler, because she didn't have the technical skills, the cash flow, or the know-how to achieve market valuation for her property. So Clark, how does this start out? Because I guarantee you when she bought it, she did a home inspection, she sweat the small stuff, she was pointing out the little bits and bobs she wanted to improve the day she bought it. I'm sure she started out with good intentions, yet she ended up, in that scenario. So Clark, how does this happen? How does it start out? What's the genesis of this also common situation we see with investors as they progress and they build a portfolio and then they end up being slumlords? How does it happen?
It happens more often than probably investors want to admit. On a side note, on that 6 unit, I think it would be very difficult I would assume that seller probably owned it free and clear. So that seller owns a 6 unit in St. Pete, in a thriving area, up and coming area, I'm sure. And somehow, even owning it free and clear, that owner was negative cash flowing with 0 tenants, right? And that to me just blows my mind. But it happens all the time, David. I mean, I think that people don't understand. They look at that and they say, why would anyone sell for an $800,000 discount? How could you negative cash flow a 6 unit when you own it free and clear, right? It just blows my mind, but it doesn't, because we see it all the time. But kind of to see, let's take a step back and see how this thing starts. Is that when that particular owner bought that property, right? It probably was in pretty good shape. Like you said, they did the inspections, and that seller probably put nice, happy tenants moving into a beautiful St. Petersburg, Florida, where the weather is nice 95% of the time. They're nice, they were quiet, and they were happy, right? So in year one, day one, they were happy. But as you kind of fast forward and got into this time machine 18 years later, you can see that they didn't end up happy. So why, David, is it that the tenants, why is it that that's happening? So you've got the happy tenants, right? Year one, day one, then what happens?
Well, that's exactly how it starts. A landlord, their primary goal is to have happy tenants, right? Happy tenants cause no stress, they cause no anxiety. And then what a lot of landlords consider to be a happy tenant is a quiet tenant. Now, there's 2 sides to that coin. A lot of tenants are pretty clever, and they understand that tenants fall into 2 buckets, really. You've got the tenant who's always calling you with every single maintenance item, just had no hesitation, how many times they call you, and that tenant is like a bug on your butt. And
it's everybody's fear, right? It's every newbie's, beginner investor's fear is exactly what you just said, right?
yeah, well, for a lot of unprepared property owners, that can be it, right? But what's the converse side of that? Is a perfect tenant is someone you never hear from, right? Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, getting that tenant that is quiet as a mouse, right? And they don't bother you. They don't call you at 3 a.m. When the faucet breaks, they fix it maybe themselves. That's the perfect tenant, right?
Yeah, right. That's what landlords want. And the tenants know
Right.
this. And the tenants have a kind of a slightly longer game at play because, there's a lot of clever tenants out there. And the tenants know when the landlord is happy and the landlord isn't getting expensive repair requests every weekend, that when it comes time to renewal, the landlord is not going to want to up the rent or change anything about this perfect situation, because the tenants, smart tenants, understand one thing, that landlords want their mortgage to be paid. So if the mortgage is being paid and the landlord is not getting repair requests, well, when it comes to renewal time, the landlord's going to keep the rent low. And this here is essentially the standoff begins right there. And it can start on year 1, it can start on year 2, but it gets there. And what happens at this point in time and what happens at this juncture, it's really, really important, because it comes to lease renewal time. Now, you're going to get a call potentially from your property manager saying, hey, listen, we got a fantastic tenant here. So I think we should keep the rent the same. We don't want to upset the cart here. They've been quiet. We don't hear from them. We don't want to go through an expensive turnover. And so I think we should keep the tenant happy. And for a lot of landlords right here, they go, yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Clark, extrapolate this over like 10 or 20 years. What happens when you're a property manager every year? You say, hey, listen, let's keep this tenant. This tenant is great. And so let's only move them by 15 or 20 or $50, right? The market rent is always creeping further away from the rent that you're receiving. So extrapolate this over 10 or 20 years. What happens? What's it look like? It seems fairly innocuous on year 1 or year 2, but what happens if that tenant, and you keep on making this decision every year for 10 or 15 or 20 years? What happens then? Extrapolate it for us from there on out.
It happens all the time. It's happened to me a bunch, and it's tough. So you have lower rent, right, David? You have very few to minimal funds for cosmetic improvements, for things that are going to break, just saving up enough money for the deferred maintenance. Things are going to break. Things are going to wear out over time, right? So now you have such a low bank account balance to be able to support those renovations in the future, right? We would like to think that tenants are going to stay in our properties for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, right? David, do you only get tenants in your rentals that stay minimum of 20 years? Or do some of those tenants maybe move out slightly before that?
Well, when tenants are on subsidized rent, Clark, they tend to stay a lot longer. And the concept, obviously, from a landlord perspective, is that's great. But what you're actually running is you've got no funds for improvements, like you say. You've got deferred maintenance building up all of the time. But eventually that tenant needs to move out for some reason. It could be after 7 years. It could be after 12 years, right? But at that point in time, the deferred maintenance has gotten so big, the landscaping is completely shot. The interior, it's not just painting carpets anymore. It's probably, you need to replace kitchens, probably need to replace bathrooms. There's a lot of work that needs to go into it. And so eventually the landlord doesn't want to, and definitely doesn't have the cash flow. Because remember, you've been collecting low rent. You haven't been collecting reserves for these type of repairs, right? And so the landlord doesn't want you, or he doesn't have the cash flow, or indeed at this point might not have the skills or the access to contractors. Because remember, he doesn't have a relationship with contractors because he's not calling any contractors ever. Right?
Right.
And so he doesn't have the money to do $30,000 worth of cosmetic improvements just to chase what the market rent is now. So let me extrapolate that. Let's say he's renting at $1,100. But market rent is $1,700, right? That's his differential that he's incurred for years and years on end now. Now, would he realistically, at the latter end of his investing journey, spend $30,000 to recoup $600 a month, right? So it's going to take him how many years? 7, 8 years just to recoup his $30,000 of cosmetic improvements.
Right.
He's not going to do it. And so what do they do then? They get their property that they started off with the great intentions. They put a tenant in, they, let that tenant slide for 8 years, 9 years, 10 years, 12 years. That tenant moves out. And this is where the slumlording starts. Okay? Because now the landlord does not want to spend $35,000, $40,000 doing a full renovation of the property so he can get in line with market rents. What he does is he'll look at the market, he'll see that, $1,800 a month is the local market rent, and he'll just put his box of crap on the rental market at $1,300. And guess what? There's a lot of people that are going to want to have that cheaper rental in the neighborhood that will put up with a substandard product, and they'll put up with substandard finishes, right? Because they're getting a cheaper rent. And for a lot of tenants, the cost of their rent is way more important than how nice the property is, right? This is where the slumlording kicks in, right? And you get what you pay for in life, right? And so you're going to get that low paying tenant avatar stays into your property. So what happens, Clark, because this is where you come in, what happens when that landlord is onto a second or third long-term, no investment, low rent? What happens? We're 18 years into ownership, let's say, at this point in time. The landlord has achieved his original goal. The mortgage is paid off. He's made little to no cash flow, which is at the latter end of your investment. Your cash flow should be parabolic, right? Because now you don't have a mortgage, right? That's where that's where the passive income comes from. But these landlords are not getting passive income because they did no improvements. And so, Clark, answer me this. What happens 18, 20 years in? Now this property has got old kicked in windows. It's filthy. The backyard is all dug up with dogs. Fence needs to be replaced. Property needs a bunch of work. And the landlord's like, you know what? I'm going to sell this now. But what happens when they go to sell it? Who's going to come knocking at their door? And who's the only person who's going to buy it? Because you've got a bit of experience here. What happens then, Clark?
Yeah, it's funny as you were explaining that. I'm picturing in my head, right? We're building this narrative. It's kind of like a play, right? And it's like exit stage left, the happy, excited investor, insert slumlord now at this point, right? So it's like a play. And now we've inserted the slumlord, the non-knowing slumlord, right? To your point earlier, it's not like anyone gets into this like, you know what? I'm only going to have the lowest quality tenants with the lowest quality properties, right? So just because, and I want to say something, a caveat is that when you hear the word slumlord, right, it brings connotations of low income areas, high crime areas, bad parts of just geographically in the United States. So wherever that may be, where it's just not a thriving area, right? You can be a slumlord in any state, in any area, high end areas, low end areas. So I want to make sure that you listening understand that you can very easily be a slumlord in the nicest area of your town that you're investing in. But so to continue on, is you've got this tired landlord. You ever heard that phrase before, David? Tired landlord. And this is kind of the place in the play that we're discussing where the landlord says, you know what, I'm tired of dealing with this, and I know I have all this deferred maintenance that I'm going to have to put my time, my energy, my efforts. I don't have good contractor connections. I don't have good financing lined up for this kind of stuff. I don't have much reserve cash flow. And one of the things that, and I've dealt with so many of these sellers where these are not people that are just like super low in. These could be fairly sophisticated people, right? And they
Yeah.
just mentally have checked out of the property, and they're like, I'm done. I'm done with this property. I'm always chasing rent. I'm always fixing faucets. But you know what they're not doing is they're not making upgrades throughout the time because they don't have the available capital. And they may not just have the energy and the mindset to understand why you should put a new roof on as opposed to just patching it when it's toward the end of its life. So what happens, right? Now you have a house that won't pass for inspection for a traditional buyer. So now I've narrowed my buyer list from everyone out there in MLS land, in Zillow land. Now I can only sell it to a cash buyer because the roof is old, the AC is old, nothing's updated. It's not going to be able to get the right type of insurance because we always want to sell it to the end buyer that's going to move in with the family. Because why do we want to sell it to the end buyer? They pay the most money because they're not looking at it as an investment per se. They just need a roof over their head and they want to be able to call it their own. And they've heard that buying real estate is a good investment to own your own house versus renting, right? Just real estate investing 101. So now we've got this landlord. He's tired. She's tired and ready to unload it. They couldn't sell it to an end buyer, a new family, if they wanted to, because it won't pass inspection. It won't get the right insurance. So now they're going to have to sell it on the open market to a flipper or a wholesaler for 20, 30, 40% discounts. So for example, let's just say you had a house that should be worth 300,000 as you were kind of consistently making repairs and upgrades throughout the tenure of the tenant. You didn't do that, and now you sell it for 200,000. So, David, what does this cost the landlord? So, kind of take me through a little bit all the different ways. This is a death of 1,000 cuts, right? This isn't just losing $100,000 worth of potential equity on year 18. Walk the listener through all the places, the death of 1,000 cuts that this owner, this seller, this landlord has lost on this case study property we're talking about.
Right. Well, thank you, Clark, because you just made a great point about who you're selling to, who you can sell to, and then over time you're limiting further and further and further, limiting who you can sell your property to. Your question, what's the price for this laziness? Let's call it laziness, or let's call it, narrow thinking. So it started out on year one where your property manager said, hey, listen, these are great tenants. Let's just move the rent $50. And so it started off being a pretty innocuous kind of thought. You're like, yeah, I don't need the money. It's
Right.
fine. Right. But let's, over time, what's happened here, let's say over 20 years, and let's say the gap between what market rent was and what your rent was on average. It wouldn't start off this big, but it would get that big after 2 or 3 or 4 years, and it would only get bigger. So I'm just going to average out that there's a $450 a month differential between what your rent that you're collecting is and what the rent on the market would be. If you extrapolate $450 a month over 15 years, that's $81,000 in rental revenue. Now, add to that the $100,000 in sales value lost in your example, that a $300,000 house having to sell for 200 because deferred maintenance all over the place. That's $181,000 over 15 years lost on one house. Now imagine you had 10 houses or 12 houses. You would be looking at nearly $2 million in cash flow and equity that you have lost simply because you were not prepared to replace your tenants every few years, get in there, update kitchens, update bathrooms, that let's say over that 15 years might have cost you $30,000 or $40,000, but at least you have great tenants top of the market rents, instead of making those what were reasonably painful decisions at the time, no, let's actually ask our tenant to move out. The easy thing to do is to keep your existing tenant. But that's $2 million over 10 or 12 homes. And you didn't even see it happening. You're the frog in the water.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
let's summarize this real quick. And just like for the listener to hear it. So Clark, just just summarize this issue as fast as you can. And then what we'll do is we'll walk the listener through exactly how to avoid this scenario, because so many people fall into this little spider's web. They don't realize that they're even in it. So can you summarize what we've been talking about for the last, 25 minutes, just so that we have it very clear in our head? Go for it.
Yeah. It's essentially, we've talked about only short-term thinking, right? So only staring at the cash flow that I'm going to get versus the money that I have to put into it, right? So, for example, the tenant calls you, the roof's leaking, and it's old. It needs to be replaced. Well, a roofer goes up there and patches it for $400, or you replace the roof for $10,000, right? And you're like, well, that's going to take 6-8 years to pay off. So obviously, I'm just going to patch it for $400. Okay. So if you only have that mindset to say, I want to keep kicking the can down the road. I don't want to burn my boats per se and do the thing that's really going to be the right thing for the bigger picture, putting that nice new $10,000 roof on, and you're only looking at cash flow. Mistake. Okay. The next thing is that, again, back to the short-term thinking in terms of you're putting all your eggs in one basket with that one tenant. Okay. So as long as that tenant stays, right, for the most part, you're just going to continue to do exactly what you've always done. I'm putting Band-Aids on things, and then I'm putting Band-Aids on the Band-Aids, right? Instead of actually taking the Band-Aid off and fixing the actual true problem. That's a very short-term way to look at it. And essentially, you are partnering, okay? The client that is in your house paying your mortgage for you, you're partnering with them, and you're putting all your eggs with that one tenant, and you are praying that they never move out, because if they do move out, you are opening up all these wounds, and you're going to have all these issues and challenges that you're going to look at. So if you can imagine, David, saying, you know what, I'm going to start a business, and I'm going to partner with that tenant that can only afford $850 a month. And I hope that they're going to do everything right, and they're going to always pay me on time, and they'll never screw up. Would you, listening to this, put all your eggs in one basket and partner with a tenant that can only afford $850 a month? Do you think that maybe they may have things that come up in their life where they need to move, or they stop paying, or things like that? I'm not putting all my eggs in a basket for a tenant for $850. And also, too, people don't think about these kind of things. Yes, the tenant has accepted a lower quality of property, right? They've made a deal. You're making a deal with the devil, right? You don't call me and I won't call you. You pay rent, I'll keep it low. Okay, that's the deal with the devil. But there's things like if you're not providing a good condition property, there could be lawsuits incoming. I'll give you an example. I had a tenant one time call me on a property, and my property manager sent me a picture, and the tenant's foot had gone through the floor. Okay, literally through the floor. And I was like, oh my God, is the tenant okay? Luckily, the house was only about 1.5 feet off the ground, but the tenant was fine. What if that tenant's foot had hit a nail? What if that tenant's foot had, cut themselves in some way, and now their leg, they had to go to the hospital? And it was all because the floor wasn't fixed right from the get-go. So there's all these things that could come from this deal. And do you think that when the attorney calls you, they're going to reference the deal that you made with the devil that says, you don't call me when there's repairs to be made and I won't raise your rent? Do you think any of that matters in a court of law when they're suing you? So these things are not things that you may think about. And that's why we want to bring these up on this episode, because it doesn't say that in the manual about getting sued. And the attorney doesn't care how low you kept the rent. You could still get sued. So that's a challenge. And then one of the last things too is that at the end of the day, you've got a property, right? And you've got one exit strategy. You've got a one-legged stool. And I don't know about you, but when I sit on a stool, I like to have 3 or 4 legs to make sure that I'm fully supported, so that if I'm keeping up and doing those things, you've got a one-legged stool right here, and your one leg is that one tenant. Going back to partnering with your tenant for $850. And also too, guess what? How excited, David, is your property manager to constantly be getting phone calls? The faucet broke again. The roof that you keep patching, guess what? It didn't work, right? You think your property manager is going to be super excited to have you as a client? You think they're going to want to go out of their way to continue to keep doing it and fixing things and calling you and bothering you and then dealing with the unhappy tenant? I don't know about you, but you're going to have a pretty unhappy property manager as well too. So with all these things being said, David, how the heck do we avoid this stuff? Like, what is it that we can do? We've kind of identified the problems that we see so many landlords make, okay? Whether they knowingly got into it or not, how do we avoid this kind of challenge?
I could tell you I'm pretty stressed listening to the last 5 minutes there. That was awful.
It comes from experience.
I hated listening to that because, my mind and how I approach real estate is the diametric opposite to all of that. In that there's lots of really high quality tenants out there, but they want a high quality home. They want a high quality finish. They want a high quality asset. And so, the how to avoid the scenario is just start out like this. Please listen to the following points. They've kept me and my portfolio pretty clear in my mind. I don't subsidize tenants' rents. I don't allow a tenant stay if there's a disparity between market and what they can afford to pay. So let me get started. How do we avoid this scenario? All of it. Number one for me, we alluded to this in a different episode, but just buying high quality neighborhoods. Now, you mentioned that you can get a slumlord anywhere. You absolutely can, but you're less likely to become a slumlord if all of the homes around you have a pretty high sense of, pride of ownership. And so that will kind of nudge you, because there's a concept that I've noticed throughout my life. If you can add value and that value is appreciated, and will drive rents higher, drive values higher, you can add that value in a high quality neighborhood. So I'll just take a number just because it make it relevant. Let's say take a $500,000 single family home neighborhood. That neighborhood is going to be pretty sweet, going to be pretty nice. And so if you make improvements to the exterior, to the roof, to the landscaping and interior, you're going to get a high quality tenant, right? Now, conversely, if you buy in a neighborhood where it's a $150,000 neighborhood and all the houses around you have got 10 cars parked on the lawn and there's, 15 people living in each house, you can make all the improvements you want to your property, but you're not really going to drive value because people are not going to really want to pay all that much more. You might have a nice kitchen, nice bathroom, but, when they drive onto the street, there's no pride of ownership. There's no real incentive for you to improve your property because it's not reciprocated. It's not valued by the market. So I would say first things first, buy in a high quality neighborhood where if you make improvements, that those improvements will add value rather than, if the whole neighborhood is in shambles, so just nothing you can do really to drive any kind of major value. That's number one. Number two, remember it is a business. You're running a business. You're not running a charity. You're not running a not-for-profit. You're not running a standoff. You're not running a negotiation. You're running a business. You're providing high-quality housing for the tenants who can afford the level of quality that you're providing. Remember that. That's really important. So you provide a good product. You have to, if you've ever heard the term, you've got to speculate to accumulate. Just because you put $30,000 down on a house or $50,000 down on a house the day you bought it does not mean that's the last dollar you're ever going to have to spend on that house. That's not what it is. Imagine you were to buy, have you ever heard the term of a business owner reinvesting in his business? You've heard that before, Clark, right?
Once or twice.
Once or twice, right? So if you run a business and your laser printer breaks down, are you just gonna just run a business without a printer? You know, in your office, or just buy in an inkjet from 1922? That's joking, obviously. But the bottom line is, it's a business. Treat it like a business. It is a business, and you get what you pay for. So treat it like a business, reinvest in it like a business, and know overall you will capture all the value that you put into it. Lease renewal. When your property manager calls you at the end of the lease term and says, hey, listen, we got these great tenants. They never call me. They're super quiet. He helps out around the place. You know, I know that, you know, I think we should only I think we should only increase the rent by $50. What does that even mean? You know, what does that mean? Like, what if your expenses, your property taxes went up by $350 this year or $550 this year? Your insurance went up by $550 this year, right? Your maintenance or your other costs have increased this year. And so what if he's saying, I think we should only move it by $50, but your costs have increased by $150? Your property manager is asking you to take $100,000 or $100 pay cut on your property for a year. You'd be amazed how many people don't know that, because they don't know what their additional costs are this year. Inflation does this. You have the cost of running your business increases every year. So I'm going to give you 2 tips on this. Don't take your property managers, I think we should raise the rent by $50 approach, right? Know that most tenants do not want to move, Clark. You know, on average, my tenants stay probably 3 to 5 years, just on average. They're not going anywhere for $50. And I keep my properties tight, and I keep them well maintained, right? Like I said, know exactly how much your expenses have increased every single year. That's really important. There's 2 parts to setting your rent every year. Know what your expenses and how they've increased, but also look at Zillow. Open up Zillow Rental on your Zillow app or on your computer. Go to the street and neighborhood and house type that your property is, and see what rents are renting for today, not last month. Don't ask your property manager what things were renting for last year. Look at live data and say, okay, here's it. 3-bedroom, 2-bath house in this neighborhood, right? And it is renting for $19.50. And there's another one for $19.25. And there's another one for $19.75. That gives you a pretty good idea that a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house in that neighborhood is renting in the 1900s. If you're renting in the 1300s, your tenant is going to see that. Say, okay, well, I'm moving your rent from 1,300 to, just say, 1,600. Your tenant is immediately going to say, well, that's a big number. I'll have to think about it for a day or 2. What your tenant is actually thinking about is your tenant is going onto Zillow. And your tenant is then realistically, emotionally, psychologically preparing themselves for the fact that they've looked at the prices, and a 3-bedroom, 2-bath in that neighborhood is $19.25. All of a sudden, your offer of $1,650 or $1,700 is an amazing offer. They're still getting a killer deal. But I don't even do that. I will tell the tenant, I'm moving your rent to $19.25. If you don't like it, that's fine. Here's a 3-month notice. But I do that so that my tenant will then they'll get angry with me. They'll do whatever. They'll look at the Zillow rental for the neighborhood. And as long as they are in a good quality product, they're like, hold on, there's no point in me moving. I have to pack all my stuff. I'm going to pay $19.50 everywhere else. And boom, you get $19.50. And it's amazing how that works, right? So don't be afraid to let your tenant move out from time to time, right? Clark, do you do like at least, I do you do at least like one full in-person walkthrough a year on your properties, or you get your property manager to do it for you? Do you walk your property to make sure that you personally are on top of it every year?
Is this where I raise my hand and say I'm not the best at this? Full disclosure, David, I have about 5 or 6 markets that I have my rentals in. And so someone listening to this that maybe doesn't have their rentals in their own backyard, maybe have some of the same challenges I have, where I just, I've got rentals that are up to 7 hours from here. And I've learned over the years, so no, I don't, to answer your questions, the ones that are local, I'll go look at them from time to time. Do I do it consistently, and can I do it better on a more systematic approach? You're damn right, I should.
Call your property manager, pay him $200 and say, can you go make an appointment with my tenant? Can you go take 50 photographs of the kitchen, the floors, the doors, the baseboards, front yard, backyard, and can you write me a report and send me a video? So 3 things: send me pictures, send me a video from, outside the house, all the way walking through, have you look at the front yards, backyard, a lot of photographs, and a report. Pay him $200, $250 for it, and do that every year. That will set you apart as an owner, and it will set your property manager apart as a property manager. And he won't resent it. If you've got 9 properties, you've just offered him $2,000 to go,
Right.
photographs. That is worth its weight in gold. So that is a strategy. If your properties are out of state, that's exactly what you should be doing.
And it also puts the tenant on notice
That's right.
that, hey, the seller cares about this property, the owner cares about this property. Maybe I should clean up a little bit, right? And when is the next time? Are they going to do it 2 times a year? Are they going to do it 3 times a year? Obviously it's written in the lease that you just have to give a 24-hour notice to be able to enter the property. And it could potentially uncover problems that then could arise to a conversation of maybe it's time for that tenant to leave. I think that a lot of time landlords are very fearful of having the tenant leave because of all the reasons that we've talked about. But ultimately, it's much better to rip the Band-Aid off if the tenant is not doing what they say they're going to do, and uncover that problem in year 1 instead of uncovering it in year 4, where the damage is much further along. You've kicked the can down the road much further. So ultimately, you may get some bad news on these walkthroughs, but I'd rather get the bad news earlier than later. It's just that simple, David.
Yeah, I think that's really valuable. What you just said is, you might not want the news, but the
Right.
bottom line is it allows you to interact with your tenant, and allows you to do something that I do. I remind my tenants regularly, hey, listen, the yards aren't looking great. I'll give you $300. Go to the store and, buy a lawnmower,
Yep.
and take, put some plants in the yard there. And I'll help them do it, you know. And it just like you say, it puts the tenants in notice. That walkthrough for me is pretty essential, So look, in summary, stay on top of your properties. Don't get lazy. Don't be afraid of a vacancy. People can extrapolate. It's like, well, one vacancy is, you could get, you might get $400 more in rent, but you're gonna be down 2 months of rent. And so if you extrapolate, 2 months of rent and what more you're going to get in rent, is that really worth it? That's not the picture. The picture is the $181,000 of deferred maintenance and, equity loss and rental loss over time. So you might be able to say that to yourself once, let me just keep the tenant in there. But over a long period of time, remember, nobody starts out wanting to be a slumlord. So the takeaway is stay on top of your properties. Don't be afraid of a $6,000 turnover or a $10,000 turnover to get a new tenant with a new paradigm on a new lease. Don't be afraid of those things, right? Look around you, keep your property in line with your neighborhood. Don't be that landlord everybody hates on the street. Just don't be that guy, right? Keep your rents tied to market rents. It's more troublesome, but way more profitable. And remember, the goal here in real estate investing is twofold. We want to live off our income, and we want to have high quality assets where our net worth is growing, not decreasing. That's really important, what I've just said. If you stay on top of your assets, your income will continue to grow and get parabolic over time as your mortgages get paid off. So you're actually giving, every time you make that decision to keep your tenant, you're actually giving yourself a pretty big pay cut. You're also reducing your net worth, because if you were to go sell the house right now, you'd have to sell it at a big discount. So simple things. Keep your rents tied to market rents. This is essential. You need the money to upkeep your property, and you need new tenants to keep high quality, well-paying tenants in place. They are less stressed. You will have less turnover, ironically. You will have less vacancy. You will have higher income, and you will have a higher net worth personally. This is a topic that is dear, dear to my heart, because it's so often I see well-intentioned real estate investors just turn into slumlords themselves. And sometimes they don't even know it. Sometimes the property manager is absolutely, essentially to blame for this. Because the property manager, he's got no real stake in the equity of the property, does he? I don't know anybody who's ever sold a property and given a percentage of the sale price to the property manager. Property manager is incentivized entirely to keep the property rented, so he gets his 8 or 9% each month. That's his incentive. So when you come to sell, have most of your big ticket items updated. All you'll have when it comes to sell your house at a full market rent is a couple of minor improvements, maybe painting, carpets and stuff like that. But every 6-7 years, get in there and, replace your floors. Every 10 years, every 12 years, get in there and replace your kitchen cabinets, your countertop. Replace the tile in your bathroom. Replace your roof. Spend some money on landscaping. Make sure you've got a nice fence on there. Make sure you paint the interior and exterior of the home at least once every 2 to 3 years. So I use these tenant turnovers, not from a purely clinical financial analysis. I use these tenant turnovers as an opportunity to get in there, make improvements, spend 10 or 12 grand, do the things that a good quality tenant would expect me to do. Then I get a higher rent, but I'm also maintaining my asset over the long term. So in conclusion, don't be a slumlord. It's harder not to be, but the frog in the water, we've just seen it so many times. So we decided to do this topic because it's near and dear to our hearts. So Clark, what's your takeaway?
Yeah, I love all those things. I wouldn't argue with any of them. For me, we've been having this discussion over the last 45 minutes, and I've reflected back on I've been in landlording business now 18 years. And I think to kind of simplify it down is that at the end of the day, we get into real estate because we want to have freedom, right? We want to change our life. We want to change our course from, listening to bosses and managers and showing up at this time and that time to be able to become more free with our time. And usually that's with financial gain and things like that. And so I think about it and I say, okay, what is about these rentals? What do they provide? Well, they provide cash flow. They provide lots of different things, right? But ultimately, the cash flow is just like the icing on the cake, David. It's just the icing on the cake, the foundation of being able to change your life, to be able to do the things that you want to do is built on these assets growing and appreciating and growing your net worth, right? So if you ask yourself the question, this roof is old. Should I replace it now, which I know is the right thing to do, or should I put a Band-Aid on it, right? Am I only looking at my cash flow, or am I thinking about the bigger picture? Because I can guarantee you right now, sitting here talking to you about this topic, that my life has changed not 1% because of the cash flow I get from these assets that I've kicked off that I've been buying for the last 18 years. However, my life has changed on a much larger scale because the appreciation, because they're growing in their asset value, and that is what's changing my life. So when I'm looking at things and I say, I've got a problem, I've got a challenge, my property manager calls me and says, we need to fix this, or should we fix it or should we replace it, right? And if I'm only asking and looking at it through a very narrow lens of, well, how does it impact my cash flow? If you're only asking yourself that question, you're asking yourself the wrong question, and you are going to become a slumlord if you already are not a slumlord, and you're going to have slumlord properties. You're going to be selling at huge discounts, and it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to happen over a long period of time. So don't be a slumlord. Don't just look at it through the lens of how does it impact my cash flow, because you're looking at it through the wrong lens, and you're looking at just the icing on the cake, and you're not looking at the foundation of what the real estate assets and building high appreciation, good quality assets can do for you. So ask yourself the question when you have these discussions with your tenants, with your property managers about becoming, essentially, do you want to become a slumlord or not, is looking at it through the wrong lens. So hopefully that enables you to have something to lean on when you have these, you're going to face these challenges, and we all do, and that's totally cool. What's the fork in the road that you're going to take? Are you going to take the cash flow fork, which is the short term, or are you going to take the long term approach? And I guarantee you, as someone that I know you've seen it and I've seen it, taking the long road, it wins every single time.
That's a great summary. The only caveat I'd put in there is don't look at the, year one or year two or year three cash flow. Cash flow has fundamentally changed my life. I have stayed on top of the quality of my assets, and I reaped higher and ever rewarding cash flow from my assets because I continuously invest in them. And so while, changing a roof or changing a kitchen floors, doors or baseboards might cost you, $10,000 or $15,000 when you're doing a high quality turnover. When you come in and you can make a considerable impact on your rent. If you are using a real estate bank account for all of your rents to go in, it makes no difference really to me if I go in and I do $6,000-$7,000 on a house. But at the back end of your ownership after 5 or 10 or 15 years, and you have your mortgages paid off and you're collecting top dollar in rent, that cash flow is absolutely liberating. That cash flow is what I live on, right? I live off rental income, and the growth in the terminal value of the asset is net worth. That's further down the line. I don't care what it is, quite frankly, but it's there and it's always growing, but I don't look at it all the time. But I do look at my cash flow, but I don't make small-minded decisions on big picture stuff because of cash flow. So I would agree with you. What I think you're alluding to there is that year one, you just bought the house. Let's say at the end of year two, just to make it more realistic, you just bought the house, and your tenant or your property manager saying, "Oh, we got a great tenant here. Let's keep them." And you can see by looking at the rental in the neighborhood that rents are $1,500 and you're rented for $13. And the temptation is go, yeah, it's $150. Why not do it? It's hard to dig your heels in and say, no, I want $1,500 for my rental property. And then your tenant says, well, I'm moving out. I think that's the cash flow you're talking about. It's that year one, year two, year three. That's the decision.
Yeah,
that's exactly what this podcast is about. We're saying don't, because all you got to do is that's where it starts. It starts in year one or two. That's where you start becoming a slumlord. So you've got to stop yourself from being a slumlord as early as you can and not make those decisions. That's where the cash flow that you're alluding to makes no difference. The cash flow in the first few years of first 7 years don't make any difference. An extra $150 makes no difference, right? But if you keep on making that lazy decision, before you know it, you're going to have a $30,000 renovation on your hands, and you upgrading your home to get market rent is going to be a much bigger decision for you. So I'm here 10 and 15 and 20 years on from some of my rentals, and I've maintained quality. And these are rentals I bought where the rent was $800 a month. And now the rent is $3,000 a month. But my debt is vanished, it's gone. And I think about what $3,000 a month. Now there's obviously property tax and insurance. So let's say of the 3,000, I get to keep 2,400. All right. That cash flow has a profound effect on paying your expenses. And if you've got a few of these, that cash flow is exactly what liberates you. So I think what you're alluding to is those first few years of cash flow when you're working, you have a job, and somebody's saying, oh, let's just do $50. And you're like, yeah, I don't want to lose, 2 months rent. You're still working. That rent's not really going to make any difference to you, I hope, because you should have reserves in place. And so in conclusion, these decisions that you make early in your investing journey have a profound effect on how quickly you can realistically retire, how quickly you can realistically live off that cash flow. And so for me, cash flow now is extremely important, but I still will not make the decision I just did it. I just had a tenant move out. I had to spend nearly $7,000 on a turnover. The tenant moved out paying, I think it was $2,200. I got a new tenant in paying $2,800. The $6,000, $7,000 that it cost me to get that new tenant, and that's an investment, will take a few years to recoup. But I have an amazing tenant who can afford today's rent, and my house is completely updated again. And I'm good, the tenant's good, and more importantly, the property's good, and the value is good. So in summary, do the right thing. Don't be the frog. Particularly early on in your investing career, because that's the slippery slope. That these slumlords make these decisions early, and then they can't back their way out of it. So maintain your properties. Don't be afraid of vacancy. Don't be afraid of going out there and finding new tenants, higher quality tenants. And I implore you, keep your properties well maintained. That's the end of it from me today.
Well said. Don't be a slumlord. Fight that urge. David, with that, we're signing off, and we look forward to it. We appreciate you listening. We hope you get a lot of value and content from these episodes, and I will see you next time.
Burn your boats.
You've been listening to the Burn Your Boats podcast with Clark Lunt and David Shaw. We would love to hear from you. Please reach out at burnyourboatswealth.com with comments, questions, and if you have a topic you would like Clark and David to discuss on an upcoming episode. We would very much appreciate it if you took the time to rate and review Burn Your Boats podcast on your favorite podcast listening app, and make sure to follow and share on social media. Content in Burn Your Boats podcast is for entertainment purposes only and is not legal or financial advice. Please review our legal disclaimer at burnyourboatswealth.com. Thank you for listening.